everybody, it's Elizabeth again, and as promised in my last video, I've decided that I'm going to start taking some of these books that I'm reading and splitting them up into smaller videos instead of doing like a giant monthly reading dump. So the book that I wanted to start talking about is At Home in the World by Tish Oxenreider. This is a memoir of a woman who has 3 kids and a husband and decided, screw it, we're going to travel the world for a year. Now, she and her husband actually have a long history of travel already. They met in Albania, I believe, and they didn't grow up, but they began their marriage, I think, pretty early in Turkey, in a place called Izmir down in the south, which I have a lot of friends that are living there now, so it was kind of interesting to read about that. And she and he have always had travel in their hearts, and they decided, okay, well, all of our kids are potty trained, and our oldest child is about to turn 11, so we should do this now while they're young enough that they can take care of themselves, while they're old enough that they can take care of themselves, but they're young enough that they don't have to, like, deal with sort of the trauma of being taken from their friends and family. They decided that they were going to travel the world with their kids, and it was just this really beautiful memoir of this woman and her family going to these different parts of the world and just choosing to live very purposefully. She is a woman of faith and a Christian, and so she just kind of took that year to recharge. Because I think in a lot of ways, something that I think that she mentioned that I've noticed as well since coming back from living overseas in Turkey is that Americans are always busy. We're always doing something. We always have something going on. And it's kind of exhausting. It's really exhausting to have that many demands on your time. And then you also have to juggle, taking care of your family, taking care of your friends, spending time with them, eating healthy and exercising and all of this stuff, and, being with your husband or wife and taking care of yourself as well. It's kind of exhausting. And so even though they spent a year hopping countries and things like that, which is exhausting in and of itself, don't get me wrong, extensive travel can be just make you bone tired. It still helped them gain a perspective of how other people choose to live, and how in this community of people who have chosen to live as expats in other places, they've created their own ways of life, and just some of the lessons that you can learn from that you can potentially, hopefully, incorporate back at home. So that book really, really spoke to me in a lot of ways, and I really recommend it. Also, it kind of cracked me up because, like, I'm reading it and it reminds me of so many of my friends that I have that have young children and are still just sort of like, well, we're going to move to another country now. Bye. And you're just like, oh my God. And it's kind of inspiring because, to me, I think that, she makes a point in her forward that most travel things are about, while you're still young or you're recently divorced and you've got to find yourself. And it's not really about how you invite others onto the trip, including your family. Very rarely is that a thing, because there's this mentality that once you get married and once you have kids, like, you've got to settle down. And again, kind of what I was saying earlier, some of that is true, but some of it isn't. And sometimes it's just a life choice that you've got to make. So I really enjoyed that book, and it definitely inspired me to immediately text my husband, like, not even into chapter 2, to be like, we've got to go somewhere. And he was just like, okay, I'm up for it. What the hell? So, warning, that might happen to you. And if it does, go for it. The other book that I read was the book Smugglers of Timbuktu by Charlie English. You can see the picture there. And this was a book, a nonfiction book, that was split into 2 parts. One part of it was the Western world's discovery and exploration of Timbuktu as a place. And then the second part of it, which was way more interesting in my opinion, was the story of the manuscripts of Timbuktu and how Al-Qaeda invaded the city and how they moved those manuscripts. One, how they kind of adjusted to life with Al-Qaeda, and two, how they began smuggling those manuscripts out of Timbuktu so that they could be safe. Because part of the issue that happened is that in all of our infinite wisdom as Western historians, we decided that because Timbuktu doesn't have a written history, it's not legit. And so all of these people with, archaeological evidence and their own customs and traditions don't count because they didn't write it down. So the big deal is that, lo and behold, they do have a written history, because it turns out that Muslims have a long history of having written records, because it's not like the Arabic script is a big deal in their religion or something. It's not like they don't have icons of people, but they have a ton of calligraphy, and it's not like they're not academic as hell. So I did enjoy the story. It was hard for me to read just because I am so utterly unfamiliar with any of that kind of history, African history, Mali history. Just take your pick. I'm unfamiliar with it. And so it was a little bit hard for me to read some of it because I didn't have a reference point for some of these things. And like, as somebody who studies history, I enjoy having reference points. So if I don't have reference points, it's very hard for me to follow along. So once I started having reference points, it was a lot easier for me to kind of get into the story. Now, I will say the one thing that kind of bothered me is that at the end of the story of them smuggling the books out of Timbuktu, it turns out that some of this amazing story that you just read might have been fabricated. And there's really no way of telling, because the man who wrote it is an investigative journalist. So he's ending the story by saying, like, look, I did go and try to verify these facts, and I couldn't verify all of them. And he kind of describes his interview with some of the key members of the story so that you get the feeling that, again, not all of these facts are completely verifiable. Which was kind of disappointing, I'll admit, and kind of like a downer at the end of it, because, you just went through this journey with them, and you're like, yeah. But, like, I don't know, if I had been him, I might have sort of warned the reader that that was coming by, like, putting some things into the story of just like, now look, this is what they say. Whether or not that actually happened, but it was still an enjoyable read. I don't know if I would want it enough to keep it, honestly, but I learned something, and that's always exciting. One of the other books I read was Very Good Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse. I listened to it on audiobook, and let me tell you how rewarding that was. Okay, so it's the first book that I've ever read by P.G. Wodehouse. I've never read any of the Jeeves before. I had seen a couple of the episodes of the Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie show, Wooster and Jeeves, and I just adored this book to the point where I know that I only have 2 credits to read for Audible this coming month, and I've already gotten the books that I'm going to read, but I kind of want to buy more of those because they're just so much fun. It is the adventures of a completely oblivious, idiotic, upper-class Englishman and his incredibly intelligent, sometimes sassy, butler, and just how the butler always seems to get him out of these scrapes. And it's just so entertaining to read how he gets into these scrapes in the first place, and also how he describes things is pretty on point. I believe that there was one description that stuck out to me in particular that said, the man's smile was so wide it circled around and met in the back. And I was like, well, that creates an image. So I rather enjoyed this one. I think that you should all read it. It is excellent. So I enjoyed that. The last book that I've read recently is Hillbilly Eulogy by J.D. Vance. It is a memoir of growing up in the quote unquote Rust Belt. And let me tell you a few things about this book. One, it is highly contentious because it is about a social class that is incredibly prideful of the way it does things. Because, as he describes, many members of this social class believe in hard work, keeping to yourself, and just pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and doing what needs to be done so that you can give your family a better future. And like, power to them. Any person that is willing to get a blue collar job so that you can provide for your family should never be looked down upon. Ever. And so I think that in this book, he does a good job of kind of talking about that pride that he has in that part of his family. Now, reason it's contentious is that he also has another part of the family that is in a similar socioeconomic class that don't really do that. The way he describes this part of his family is that because of some trauma that they've gone through in their lives, but also just because of the personal choices that they make, there's not a lot of change happening. They kind of make a lot of excuses for themselves, and they take advantage of the people around them to do what needs to be done. There was a description in the story of how he was working at a grocery store, barely making ends meet with the money that he's getting, and yet every couple of weeks, his neighbors, who are welfare queens, as he described them, are coming in buying like ridiculous things with their welfare checks, and he's sort of sitting there like, what the hell? And it's this really gross tension, because while part of his family is the part of his family that's like, no, damn it, you're gonna work your ass off, and that's how you're gonna achieve the American dream. There's another part of his family that is just disappointing and kind of also terrifying. He brings in some statistics about the different traumas that families go through that are the statistics are higher if they were from the same economic class as he was, and it's interesting to read about. Now, a lot of people are saying that this book explains how Trump got into office. Yes and no. It definitely explained to me personally some stuff about where my family comes from, because I mentioned in the last video, this was sent to me by a cousin who grew up in the same town as this guy did. And in fact, my family, my dad's side of the family, grew up in a town like 20 minutes north. And so it's interesting for me to read about these things because some of the mentality, not all of it, but especially just some of the mentality of, well, you don't start fights, but you sure as hell finish them, like, are verbatim from my family. So it's interesting to kind of read some of these things and recognize parts of my family culture in it, but then also recognize like how far I am from it, because I am incredibly upper middle class. I am a part of that comfortable, educated aspect of society. I recognize that. And so it was also interesting to kind of read how he has to adjust from this high level of dysfunction in his life to he gets into Yale and is suddenly hobnobbing with these incredibly wealthy people who he has never really dealt with before. And it's interesting to see how he had to adjust to some of that, and how like some of it makes him justifiably angry. These people that are in Yale are getting ahead entirely because of their contacts. Now, obviously, you do have to have the good grades and money helps, but their contacts and the contacts that they're making are one of the ways that they are using their social currency to get through life. And the funny thing is, that's true in pretty much every socioeconomic sphere, um, in the sense that I've gotten jobs in my tier of existence because of people that I know. And it's the same thing for pretty much everyone. You'll probably get a job for people that you know. In fact, his family moved to Middletown, Ohio because they got a job at a factory and everyone else came with them. So the factories were like, hey guys, we have jobs, invite your entire family here. And so they also got jobs because of who they knew. But it's this weird idea of climbing the social ladder that I found fascinating, but also disturbing in some ways. So it is nothing else if not a thought-provoking book. I know that a lot of people have a problem with it. A lot of people think it's the greatest thing ever, and a lot of people have a problem with it, especially because some people believe that he's being rather derogatory about the class that he grew up in. I didn't get that vibe. I never thought that he was being insulting or demeaning. I always thought that he had a lot of respect and love for the people he grew up with, including his mom, who was pretty dysfunctional. But I don't know. I would be very interested to hear if any of you guys have read it and what your thoughts are, and including kind of how it fits into your experience of your American life. Or if you're not from America and you happen to be watching this, like, absolutely tell me if you've read it, how it matches or doesn't match with your life, or some sort of observations that you've made. I'd be really interested. I'm trying to get my husband to read it so he can also give me some feedback. My mom read it, and we had a very long conversation about jobs and mentality about jobs, and because I'm kind of messing with some of that in my life right now, and just how some people are giving me advice based on mentalities that I have never had any contact with, and I am almost appalled by. But if I step back and like look at the way that they've lived their lives, it makes more sense, and I can have a lot more empathy, and I can also listen to their advice and be like, okay, is this worth listening to or not? So I would absolutely recommend it. Hillbilly Eulogy by J.D. Vance. So those are really all I've read so far this month. I again, I think my husband's home. Highly recommend At Home in the World by Tish Oxenreider and Hillbilly Eulogy by J.D. Vance. Any comments or concerns or anything? Let me know. All right, have a good day. Bye.